In the spring of 1974, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Pratt, Kansas, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Buell paid $40 for something the Pratt County auctioneer almost didn't bother listing. It wasn't a tractor. It wasn't a planter. It wasn't anything with an engine or a serial number or a reason to be on a bill of sale. What Lorene Buell paid $40 for was a quarter-mile strip of land running down the center of a 320-acre dryland wheat farm, a strip that hadn't been plowed in 11 years, that the previous owner had fenced off and abandoned after a drainage tile failed in 1963, and that had since grown back into a tangle of big blue stem, side oats grama, buffalo grass, Indian paintbrush, and what the auctioneer described without enthusiasm as a considerable quantity of volunteer weeds. The strip was 60 feet wide. It ran north to south. It divided the farm's two fields as neatly and inconveniently as a fence line nobody had asked for. The rest of the farm, the two cultivated fields flanking it on either side, had sold the previous hour to a neighbor named Dale Richter, who bought them at $185 an acre, and immediately told his brother-in-law he planned to hire a dozer to clear that useless strip and plant the whole thing edge to edge before fall. Lorene Buell had bid on the strip separately when the auctioneer offered it as a remnant lot. She paid $40 for it because that's what it took to beat out a scrap wire dealer from Kingman who wanted the old fence posts. The auctioneer thanked her without making eye contact. By the time Lorene drove home to her place 4 miles east on County Road 56, the story had already reached the co-op on Main Street in Pratt. By that evening, it was at the diner on First Avenue. By Sunday, it had made the church parking lot at First Lutheran, where it acquired the detail, entirely invented, that she had paid for it with a coffee can full of quarters. People said she'd bought herself a weed patch. They said she'd paid $40 for a fence row. They said Harlan Buell's daughter had finally gone and done something her father never would have done, which was waste good money on bad ground. They were not entirely wrong about the last part. Harlan Buell would not have paid $40 for that strip, but not for the reason they assumed. Let me tell you about Lorene Buell, because what she did with that 60-foot strip of native grass only makes sense if you understand who she was, where she came from, and what she had already spent 11 years quietly learning before she ever set foot at that liquidation sale. Lorene was born in 1943 on a 480-acre dryland operation in Pratt County, Kansas, the second of 3 children and the only one who stayed. Her father, Harlan Buell, farmed wheat and milo and ran a small cow-calf operation on the south pasture. He was not a large man, and he was not a loud man, but he was the kind of man who read the same 3 books every winter. A 1938 USDA soil survey of Pratt County, a worn copy of Hugh Hammond Bennett's Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment, and a paperback field guide to Great Plains native grasses he'd ordered from a university extension office in 1951 and annotated in pencil until the margins were full. Harlan Buell believed, with the conviction of a man who had watched the Dust Bowl from a farmhouse window as a boy, that the land had a memory, that it remembered what had covered it before the plow, and that given half a chance, it would try to go back. He didn't think this was a problem. He thought it was the most useful thing he knew. Harlan had never gone past 8th grade, but he had spent 40 years watching what happened to fields with no cover, fields with broken windbreaks, fields where the soil had been worked to powder and left bare through November and March. He watched his neighbor's topsoil move. He watched it pile against fence lines and fill road ditches and coat the white paint on the grain elevator in town with a film of red-brown dust after every hard wind out of the southwest. He planted shelter belts on the west and north sides of his fields in 1949 using bare-root cottonwood and eastern red cedar stock from the Soil Conservation Service. And he left the grass waterways in his draws untouched when every other farmer in the county was tiling and plowing through them in the 1950s expansion. His neighbors thought he was leaving money on the table. Harlan thought they were confusing the table with the floor. Lorene grew up walking those fields with him. She learned the grass species by their seed heads and their growth habits and the way they felt under her boots in August. She learned that big blue stem could put roots down 8 feet in good soil, and that buffalo grass could hold a hillside through a 3-year drought that would turn a worked field to powder. She learned that the cottonwood shelter belts her father had planted reduced wind velocity across the open fields by 30 to 40% within a distance of 10 times the tree height, and that this was not a small thing in a county where the wind came hard, out of the southwest from April through June, with nothing between it and the field, but whatever a farmer had been willing to leave standing. She was supposed to leave. She had a suitcase packed in the fall of 1961 and a bus ticket to Wichita, where a cousin had offered her a room and a job at a textile company. She was 18 years old, and she had the ticket in her coat pocket for 6 weeks. She never used it. Her mother had a bad winter that year and then a worse spring, and by the time her mother was well enough that leaving felt possible again. Lorene had already taken over the bookkeeping and the equipment maintenance schedule and 100 small daily decisions that had quietly reorganized themselves around her presence. She put the bus ticket in the drawer of her father's desk and left it there. She didn't think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as a different kind of going somewhere. Harlan died in February of 1969. He left Lorene the farm free and clear, 480 acres, no mortgage, no operating loan, no equipment debt. He left her the shelter belts he'd planted 20 years earlier, which were now 30-foot cottonwoods and dense walls of cedar that the county extension agent had once called the best-maintained windbreaks in Pratt County. He left her the grass waterways, the untouched draws, the south pasture with its native grass cover that had never been broken. He left her $14,200 in a savings account at First National Bank in Pratt, which she left untouched for 3 years while she figured out exactly what she was going to do. And he left her his 3 books, annotated in pencil, with a note tucked inside the soil survey that said, "The land will tell you what it needs. You already know how to listen." Lorene farmed the 480 acres alone for 5 years after Harlan died. She hired day labor at planting and harvest. She maintained the equipment herself in the shop behind the house where her father had kept a drill press, a floor jack, a welding rig, and enough spare parts to rebuild most of what he owned without a dealer visit. She kept a ledger the same way Harlan had kept one. Every dollar in, every dollar out, every repair cost, every fuel bill, every bushel yield per field per year, going back to 1962. Not because she enjoyed bookkeeping, but because the ledger told her the truth about her operation, and Lorene Buell preferred truth to comfort. By the spring of 1974, when she drove to that liquidation sale, she had $31,000 in the bank. She had no debt. She had a paid-for farm with paid-for equipment and a savings account that had grown every year since she'd taken over, because her costs were lower than her neighbors' costs in ways that were difficult to explain until you walked the farm and saw the shelter belts and the grass waterways and understood that a farm with good windbreaks and intact soil cover loses less moisture, requires less fuel to work, and yields more consistently in dry years than a farm that has been stripped clean and planted edge to edge. Harlan had built that into the land over 40 years, and Lorene had inherited it the way you inherit a philosophy, not as a document, but as a set of decisions she already knew how to make. Now, the Strip. When Lorene looked at that 60-foot band of native grass running down the center of the Richter farm's former acreage, she didn't see what everyone else saw. She didn't see weeds. She didn't see wasted ground. She saw a functioning native grass corridor in a county that had spent 20 years systematically eliminating every native grass corridor it had. She saw big blue stem and side oats grama that had been growing undisturbed for 11 years, with root systems that went down 4 and 5 feet into the soil. She saw a windbreak that ran north to south, the exact orientation needed to intercept the prevailing southwest winds that came across open ground in April and May, when the wheat was young and the soil was bare between the rows. She saw something that would have taken 30 years to grow from scratch, and that the county was about to pay a dozer operator to destroy. She had not decided to buy it on impulse. Let me be clear about that, because the story that traveled from the co-op to the diner to the church parking lot was the story of an impulsive woman spending $40 on a weed patch. That was not what happened. What happened was that Lorene had been watching that strip for 2 years, since she'd first heard that the Richter farm was going to be liquidated. She had walked it in the fall of 1972, with the owner's permission, and taken notes on the grass species present. She had measured the strip's width and orientation with a tape measure and a compass. She had gone home and drawn it on graph paper in relation to the 2 cultivated fields flanking it, and she had calculated the wind protection geometry the same way her father had calculated it for his shelter belts: tree height, distance, velocity reduction percentage. The strip was 60 feet wide and 12 feet tall at the center. It would reduce wind velocity across the flanking fields by 25 to 35%, within a distance of 600 feet on the leeward side. It would reduce soil moisture evaporation in those same fields by an amount she estimated at 15 to 20% in a dry spring. It would hold the topsoil in place during the April wind events that had, in her ledger, cost her measurable yield in 3 of the past 10 years. She had figured all of this out before she ever bid. She had figured it out before the farm even went to sale. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing $40 thrown at a weed patch. They were watching 2 years of calculation reach its conclusion. The strip was hers. Dale Richter plowed his 2 fields in May of 1974 and planted them edge to edge, right up to the fence line on both sides of the strip. He told his brother-in-law he'd get the dozer in there in the fall, after harvest, and put that ground to work. He didn't. The fall got busy, the way falls do. And then it was winter, and then it was spring again, and the strip was still there. And Lorene had quietly run a single strand of wire along both fence lines to establish her property boundary, which was all she needed to do. The strip cost her nothing to maintain. The native grass required no water, no fertilizer, no herbicide, no cultivation. It required nothing but to be left alone, which was the one thing Lorene Buell was exceptionally good at doing with things that didn't need her interference. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 8 years, because this is where the story stops being about a 60-foot strip of grass and starts being about something else entirely. Lorene farmed her 480 acres through the mid-1970s and into the early 1980s with the same approach she'd inherited from Harlan. Low costs, no debt, maintained windbreaks, intact grass waterways, a ledger that told her the truth every December. She bought a used John Deere 7000 planter in 1976 for $1,400 cash, rebuilt the row units herself in the shop over 2 winters, and got 8 years of reliable service from it. She bought a 1968 combine from an estate sale in 1977 for $3,200 and put $840 into it before the first harvest. She kept her operating costs below $45 per acre in years when her neighbors were spending $65 and $70, not because she was cutting corners, but because she had inherited a farm that didn't need the inputs that farms without windbreaks and without grass cover needed. Her fuel costs were lower because her soil worked easier. Her seed costs were lower because her germination rates were higher in dry springs when her fields held moisture and her neighbors didn't. Her yield variability was lower because the wind protection the shelter belts and the strip provided meant her wheat didn't get sandblasted in April. She saved between $4,000 and $6,000 a year. Every year, she put it in the bank and left it there. You know what happened in the early 1980s. You know about the interest rates that went to 18% and the land values that had been bid up through the late 1970s on borrowed money, and the commodity prices that collapsed when the Soviet grain embargo hit and the export market dried up. You know that corn went below $2 a bushel and wheat went below $3, and that farmers who had borrowed at 15 and 18% to buy land at $800 an acre found themselves holding land worth $400 an acre with payments they couldn't make on prices that didn't cover their costs. You know that Pratt County lost 43 farms between 1981 and 1986. 43 families. Some of them were bad managers. Most of them were not. Most of them were good farmers who had built their operations on borrowed money during a decade when every banker and every extension agent and every farm publication in the country told them that land only went up and that leverage was the intelligent approach and that the farmer who wasn't expanding was falling behind. They believed it because it had been true for 15 years. Then it stopped being true, and the debt remained. Dale Richter lost his operation in the spring of 1983. He'd borrowed $340,000 in 1978 to buy 2 adjacent farms at peak prices. And when the payments came due against $2.80 wheat and 18% interest, the numbers didn't work and the bank didn't wait. His 2 fields, the ones that had flanked Lorene's strip for 9 years, went to auction in April of 1983. Lorene watched it from the road, not with satisfaction. With the quiet sadness of a woman who had known Dale Richter since they were both in grade school, and who understood that what had happened to him was not a failure of character, but a failure of arithmetic, and that the arithmetic had been presented to him as wisdom by people who should have known better. The 2 fields sold at auction for $210 an acre. The opening bid had been $180. Lorene had $91,000 in the bank, She bid on both fields. She bid $215 an acre. The only other bidder was a land investment company out of Wichita that had been buying distressed farm ground across south-central Kansas for 2 years. They went to $220. She went to $225. They went to $230. She went to $240 and stopped because she had done the math, and $240 was the number above which the fields would not cash flow at current wheat prices, and she did not buy things that didn't cash flow. The investment company bought both fields at $245 an acre. She let them go. She drove home and updated her ledger. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years and then watched that person sit quietly while the proof accumulated, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Because what happened 18 months later is the part that Harlan Buell would have understood without a single word of explanation. In June of 1984, the investment company put both fields back on the market. They had discovered in the process of trying to farm them that the fields without the strip produced inconsistently in dry years, that the topsoil on the western edges had been losing ground to wind erosion since Dale Richter had plowed right up to the fence line in 1974, and that the per-acre yields were running 15 to 20% below the county average in the dry springs that Pratt County reliably produced. They listed the fields at $230 an acre and found no buyers. They dropped to $210, still no buyers. The farm crisis had not resolved itself, and nobody in Pratt County was buying marginal ground at any price. They dropped to $185 an acre in September of 1984 and called Lorene directly because someone in Pratt had told them that the woman who owned the strip in the middle was the only person who could make those fields work, and that if they wanted to sell, she was the person to call. She met their representative at the farm on a Tuesday morning in October. She walked both fields with him. She looked at the soil on the western edges where the erosion had been running for 10 years. She looked at the strip, still standing, still green at the margins where the big blue stem had spread, another 8 feet into the fence line on both sides. She made an offer of $170 an acre for both fields combined. 320 acres, cash, close in 30 days. He called her back the next morning and accepted. She wrote a check for $54,400 at the First National Bank in Pratt, Kansas, in October of 1984. The bank president, a man named Gerald Foss, who had known Lorene since she was 12 years old, and who had watched 43 farm families lose their operations in the past 3 years, held the check for a moment before he processed it. He didn't say anything. He handed it back to the teller and nodded once, and Lorene Buell walked out of First National Bank in Pratt, Kansas, the owner of 800 acres of dryland wheat ground with no mortgage, no operating loan, and a 60-foot strip of native grass running down the center of it that she had paid $40 for in 1974. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the bank to the co-op, from the co-op to the diner, from the diner to the church parking lot at First Lutheran, where it did not acquire any invented details this time, because the real details were already sufficient. People said she'd bought those fields for $100 an acre, less than Dale Richter had paid for them at the peak. People said she'd paid $40 for a weed patch and then used the weed patch to make the fields worth buying. People said Harlan Buell's daughter had finally done something her father would have understood, and they said it without irony, because by October of 1984, irony required a kind of comfort that Pratt County didn't have anymore. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that takes the longest to understand, and it has nothing to do with the land purchase. Lorene farmed all 800 acres through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. She hired a part-time hand in 1986, a young man named Curtis Hale, who had grown up on a farm 2 counties over and who arrived knowing how to drive and how to weld and not much else about the kind of farming Lorene practiced. She taught him the rest. She taught him the grass species in the strip and the waterways. She taught him the wind geometry, how to calculate protection distance from a windbreak's height, how to read the soil surface in March for signs of erosion beginning, how to look at a bare field in April and understand what was happening to it that wouldn't show up in the yield numbers until August. She taught him to keep a ledger the way her father had taught her, with every dollar accounted for and every decision written down, so that the pattern became visible over years, not just months. The 1988 drought hit Pratt County hard. The county average wheat yield that year was 11 bushels per acre. Lorene's 800 acres averaged 16. The difference was not luck. The difference was soil moisture retention in fields protected from the desiccating southwest winds by the shelter belts her father had planted in 1949 and the grass strip she had preserved in 1974. The difference was topsoil that had stayed where it was put instead of moving to the road ditch. The difference was a farm that had been managed for 40 years on the assumption that the bad years would come, and that the only preparation that mattered was the preparation you did before you needed it. In the fall of 1991, the Pratt County Soil Conservation District invited Lorene to speak at their annual meeting. She was 48 years old. She had been farming for 22 years. She had 800 acres, no debt, and a savings account she didn't discuss in public. She stood at the front of the meeting room at the Pratt County Fairgrounds and looked out at about 60 farmers, most of whom she had known her entire life. And she said this: "When my father planted those shelter belts in 1949, his neighbors said he was wasting ground that could be producing wheat. He was wasting about 12 acres of production on trees that would take 20 years to grow. They were right about the 20 years. They were wrong about the waste. What they couldn't see was that the 12 acres he gave up in production, he got back 3 times over in yield stability on the remaining acres, because a field that doesn't lose its topsoil and doesn't lose its moisture in a dry spring produces more over 30 years than a field that does, even if it's a few acres smaller. My father understood that you don't measure a farm by what it does in a good year. You measure it by what it does in a bad one." She paused. The room was quiet. "I bought that strip down the middle of the Richter ground in 1974 for $40. People thought I was foolish. I thought I was buying the cheapest windbreak I would ever find. I was right. That strip protected the soil moisture in those fields for 10 years before I owned them, and it's protected them for 10 years since. It costs me nothing to maintain. It will cost me nothing to replace, because I am not going to replace it. The 60-foot strip of native grass that the county thought was a weed patch is the most productive 60 feet on my farm, and it has never produced a single bushel of wheat." She sat down. A man in the third row, a farmer named Vernon Schrag, who had farmed next to the Buell place for 30 years, and who had been one of the voices at the co-op in 1974, saying Harlan's daughter had gone and done something foolish, took his cap off and held it in his lap, and didn't put it back on for the rest of the meeting. He found her in the parking lot afterward and told her that her father had been a better farmer than he'd understood at the time. Lorene thanked him and said Harlan would have been glad to hear it. She meant it without reservation. Curtis Hale took over primary operation of the farm in 1998, when Lorene was 55 and had decided that her knees had earned a reduction in her daily workload, if not a full retirement. He managed it the way she had managed it because she had spent 12 years teaching him to see the farm the way she saw it, not as a collection of acres to be maximized in any given year, but as a system that had to be kept in balance across decades. The shelter belts her father had planted in 1949 were 50 years old by then, and some of the cottonwoods were beginning to decline. And Lorene spent 2 years replanting the gaps with new stock from the Soil Conservation Service, the same way her father had planted the originals. The strip was 24 years old. The big blue stem in its center had root systems that went down 6 feet. It had spread another 12 feet on both sides of the original fence line, and Lorene had let it spread because the spread was free, and the protection was real, and there was no reason in the world to stop something from doing exactly what she had paid $40 for it to do. Her niece, a girl named Cassie Buell, who was 15 in 2001, and who had been spending summers on the farm since she was 8, learned to identify the grass species in the strip the same way Lorene had learned them, by walking the strip in August with someone who knew their names and their habits and their root depths and the specific ways they held soil and moisture in a dry year. Cassie learned the ledger. She learned the wind geometry. She learned to look at a bare field in March and read what was happening to it. She learned it in the same shop where Harlan Buell had kept his drill press and his floor jack and his welding rig with the same tools that Lorene had used and that Harlan had used before her, because the tools still worked and there was no reason to replace them with something that cost more and did the same job. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a 60-foot strip of native grass running down the center of a wheat field? Most people see wasted ground. They see acres that aren't producing. They see a weed patch that a dozer could fix in an afternoon. Lorene Buell saw a windbreak that had been growing for 11 years before she bought it, that would continue growing for decades after. That required 0 inputs and 0 maintenance and 0 operating cost. And that would protect the soil and moisture of the fields around it through every drought and every hard wind that Pratt County produced, for as long as it was left standing. She saw the cheapest insurance policy available in Pratt County in 1974, and she paid $40 for it, and she was right. That's the difference between someone who buys acres and someone who reads the land. $40, a liquidation sale. A woman who had spent her entire life learning to see what her father had taught her to see. The strip nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the wind came and the topsoil stayed.